So it's an honor tonight. It is such an honor tonight to spend time with a group so passionate about aviation. And that's what I told Chris, being it's our first time to Oshkosh. I had no idea how passionate a group could be about aviation in general, about every detail of it. And to our spouses who allow us to be passionate and who tolerate our addiction to adrenaline, thank you very much. Desert Storm was in August of 1990. And since that time, almost 26 years ago, our Department of Defense has been at some state of war or conflict. And our airmen are adapting, innovating, and evolving to the changing battle space daily. So this is not about me. This is not about just my current duties. It's about the over 300,000 airmen who serve in your Air Force every day. Of those over 300,000 airmen, only 12,000 are pilots. That's something that surprises people. 6,000 do other rated duties, but the rest allow us to go do what our nation needs to get done, to allow the service to go forward and us to prosper. Let's bring it back down a little bit. My current assignment, as Chris said, is to the 9th Reconnaissance Wing at Beale Air Force Base, a phenomenal 23,000-acre base just north of Sacramento, California. And we have incredible assets out there. We have the U-2. I think you're familiar. I was going to talk about it a little bit more today on the stage, but then I looked around and realized, why is the tablecloth black and your napkins red? Because our aircraft are black and our tail flashes are red. This entire venue is designed after Beale Air Force Base aircraft. So I went to our U-2 team and I said, okay team, this is a unique opportunity to talk to an amazing group. What's the one thing you want me to make sure they understand? I want to give them some insider information. And they said, make sure they understand what the view from our office looks like. How awesome is that? The other thing we were talking about at our table up here, this is the middle of the day. The middle of the day. Now here comes the insider information, because you guys have probably seen a picture like this before, right? Realize this is a side of the aircraft facing the sun. This is the other side. I can tell I'm in a room of aviators when I get that moan, because we do not like visible ice accumulation, all right? We like it even less when we're over 10 miles high and we're in a spacesuit. But rest assured, when we turn the aircraft around, it dissipates very quickly. Probably because we're so close to the sun. So our U-2 pilots, when they are not flying combat operational missions, they only get to fly about 3 times a month. What we call 2 lows and a high. 1 time above 50,000 feet, 2 times to practice landings and takeoffs for an hour below that. Does any pilot want to only fly 3 times a month? No. Luckily, we have a fleet of T-38 companion trainer program so that they can go up and maintain all their instrument proficiencies, everything the FAA and the U.S. Air Force wants us to maintain. Plus, it's pretty cool to have a flight of T-38s, right? What else do we have? As Chris said, we have the Global Hawk. And this is one of the first times the Air Force has put one of us on the stage to really talk about the Global Hawk itself. When I'm talking about it, I like to say, we're a new airframe, we've only been around for 12 years. But nobody's ever really asked us that much. So let's focus on the Global Hawk tonight. Okay, here you go. In one sentence, I'm going to tell you what the Global Hawk is. It's an RQ-4. It's an LDHD HAIL RPA with EISS 24/7 ISR. Okay, Chris, I'm done. I'm out. Okay, seriously. This is how I talk when I'm in my flight suit, on duty at Beale Air Force Base. And why did I put it up there tonight? To remind you that although we're all aviators, we speak a different language. We really do. And it's no matter what stovepipe you grew up in, we speak a little bit different. So let's try this again. The Global Hawk is a low-density, high-demand, high-altitude, long-endurance, remotely piloted aircraft with an integrated sensor suite that delivers global all-weather day-night intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance capability. Now, do you understand that a little bit better? Okay, that's why I'm on the stage tonight. I want to give you a little bit of insight into the rapidly evolving world of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And I want to give you a little bit of information about how awesome the Global Hawk is and how it really operates. Because I will tell you, I have fielded some pretty crazy questions out there in my little time here. And I want you to understand better what we can do, what we are, and what the future holds for this platform and the many like it as we move forward. So first, we need to define terms that we may have differently, right? Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance is what I do. It's what the 9th Wing does. It's why right now our airmen from our wing are flying combat missions for 7 different combatant commanders in 5 different time zones worldwide. That's one Air Force base. So I'm not going to take it lightly to go, everybody knows what intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance is. It has a simple goal: decision advantage. Provide decision advantage. It's the fleeting opportunity to allow our leaders to make strategic, operational, and tactical level decisions with more timely, accurate, and thorough information than our opponent. Who would disagree with that? It's a fleeting opportunity, though. We have to streamline the collection or the surveillance and reconnaissance with intelligence making, or making it mean something, and transmitting to the decision-making commanders. It's not an easy thing to do, but that's our goal: decision advantage. Okay, before we talk about where we are, we kind of have to talk about how we got there, right? This is how a pilot talks about everything. So let's go back to 2004. The Department of Defense flew 50,000 hours in Global Hawk type aircraft. 50,000. Although that sounds like a lot, in the big scheme of the Air Force, it's a drop in the bucket. Now let's get a little personal for a minute. I was a young major, newly assigned to the Air Force Pentagon. Worked with 25,000 of my closest friends who were commuting to the same building every day. Great title, the Pilot Career Field Manager. I worked with 2 other career field managers for the rated side, the Navigator Career Field Manager and the Air Battle Manager. Our boss walked in one day and said, "I have a great opportunity. I need a volunteer." Which in the military, you know that means it's not a good deal, right? We have an emerging enterprise that somebody needs to be on the ground to lead as we move forward. And all 3 of us looked at each other, reverted back to basic training, started making sure our shoes are tied, don't make eye contact. And then I learned a new military word. I was quickly voluntold that this would be my next few years. So voluntold, what does that mean? It's when you need a volunteer for something and you don't get one. And so as the ranking officer, you look at somebody and go, "You are my enthusiastic volunteer for this program." And you go, "Yes, sir, I'll do it." Little did I know that this enterprise was going to grow across the next years into over 500,000 annual hours is how much the Department of Defense flies. And the future of our Air Force, of aviation in some capacity, which we'll talk about here tonight. The Global Hawk itself amassed over 100,000 hours in its first 15 years, from 1998 to 2013. Every Global Hawk driver around the world, they gave out this patch so we could wear it. Pretty cool, right? That was a while ago. It was about 3 years ago. So I went to the company and said, "Hey, you who track flight hours, when are we going to make our next mark and get our magic patch?" Well, I'll tell you, on the flight down here, I found out we flew our 200,000th hour this week in 3 years, 2013 to 2016. So I made my own patch. I hope you don't mind. I'm pretty sure they're going to copy the same patch when they make theirs. Okay, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about one thing that is very emotional to aviators worldwide. Because words mean things, right? They evoke emotion, either positive or negative, either friendly or hostile. So we call it the definition dogfight, because there is one word that Global Hawk drivers around the world don't like, and we flinch a little bit when we hear it. Drones. What's a drone? A remote-controlled, pilotless aircraft. Really? A remote-controlled, pilotless aircraft. Is that what this aircraft is? I tried to get my wife to stop and let me play at the drone cage out on the flight line. It didn't work, by the way. But that's a drone. This takes away from the expertise we have in operating and the true control we have over our craft. So it progressed to UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. Awesome. Unmanned. If it's unmanned, why is the 9th Reconnaissance Wing 7,000 airmen strong who work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year? If it's unmanned, why does it take over 200 people for every single flight of the Global Hawk? Needless to say, I don't like that one. So how about this one? Remotely piloted aircraft. It flows, doesn't it? But a mentality shift is hard to have. Remotely, it reminds everybody we're geo-separated from our air vehicle. Piloted. Our pilots require the same three-dimensional expertise of every other aircraft in the world. We talk to the same controllers you do. We talk to ground. We talk to tower. We talk to departure. NorCal approach for me, Oakland Center as I climb out. Is that any different? Aircraft. Yes, surprise, we're an aircraft. What else is going to surprise many of you tonight is the size of our aircraft that we're going to talk about here in a minute. Going back to my cubicle in the Pentagon, one of the other things I was afforded the opportunity to do is take unmanned aerial vehicle when the leaders of the Pentagon said, come up with a new word. So in true military fashion, we met for about 6 months. It was painful. We talked about every word in the dictionary before we came up with remotely piloted aircraft. So I am emotional in my plea. They're not drones, they're remotely piloted. Now to baseline your knowledge. How much do you know about remotely piloted aircraft? Let's find out. Do you know which one are intelligence only? Or which ones are capable of carrying weapons? Think about it. If I show you their plan forms, can you tell them apart? Do you know their names and designations? Did you know that we fly them in 3 services? In the Army, in the Navy, and in the Air Force. If you did, I'm done. We're good. But I bet many of you didn't realize, if I take your eyes back to their plan form, that these are not drawn to scale. And I did that intentionally. So now as aviators, we know certain aircraft, right? Many of you flew in on a 757 or something close to it. We have our own opinions of the basic twin-engine and single-engine civilian aircraft, right? They're sitting on the ramp. There's about 4 billion of them sitting on the ramp right now. I'm a Thunderbird pilot. I've never seen this big of an air show in my life. And when we talk remotely piloted aircraft, you probably think of the Reaper, because what the Air Force talks about the most. But did you realize that its bigger sister, the Predator and then the Reaper, or the mighty Global Hawk? Now the difference in this slide is it's drawn to scale. So that Predator comes in at a whopping 50-foot wingspan, still bigger than most civilian aviation, right? Its sister is 16 feet larger. And that 757 you flew in here on, 125 feet. That's a big aircraft, right? But what about the Global Hawk? It sure looks bigger. How about 131 feet? So here's what I say. Next time you're on an airplane and you're not paying attention to the people that are talking to you, asking you to pay attention to them, and you see that card you're supposed to be holding in the pocket in front of you, and it says 757, look around. You are sitting inside an aircraft that is smaller than a Global Hawk. That is the size of our aircraft. Now, why do I throw this up? Because most of the time, when people talk about remotely piloted aircraft, they lump them all together. Remotely piloted aircraft are all that unmanned stuff, all the drones, right? Realize they're actually in 5 different groups. From the altitude we fly, to the speed we fly, to the weight of our aircraft. These groups range from 4.5 feet to 131 feet. Is that fair to have an educated discussion with that big of a range? Let's switch the gears. Let me talk about proximately manned aircraft, and I will group together the C-5, the 777, the 152, and the F-35. And let's talk about the future of proximately manned aircraft. What kind of conversation do you think we would have? It's hard to have that. Different sizes, different requirements, different capabilities. So one thing I threw in there, proximately manned, right? Have you ever heard that before? I made it up. Here's the beauty of the military. When we don't have a word for something we need, what do? It's like voluntold. We make it up. Here's what else I learned at the Pentagon. If you see it on a presentation 3 times, it becomes fact. So I will use that word 3 times in my presentation because we don't really have a way of disseminating between proximately manned or sitting in your cockpit on your physical aircraft and geo-separated from your air vehicle like we talked about with remotely piloted. Tonight we're going to talk about Group 5, specifically the RQ-4, the Global Hawk. The Global Hawk itself. Northrop Grumman is the lead contractor on the Global Hawk. When I first started flying, whoever the lead contractor was the owning contractor and everything else to go with that airframe, right? Not anymore. Now we get companies around the country, across the defense enterprise, so that we have the most capable and high-tech aircraft possible. It's not different on the Global Hawk than it is on your civilian aviation. But this is a good slide to highlight how many minds came together when this aircraft was a DARPA project, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. They're the ones that built it and handed it over to the Air Force. These are the companies that made it happen. And when we see an aircraft as an aviator, what does every pilot in the room want to know? What's underneath? So let's look at the top side. And you'll realize we have 4 UHF antennas, 2 SATCOM antennas, an international maritime marine satellite connection. The top side is kind of how we talk to our aircraft. And that's what goes on that side. Now let's switch over to the business side of the aircraft. Once we look inside, we see some sensors, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. But we also see a common data link with multiple points on there. That's how we connect to the ground, to the people in the fight that we are supporting. We have a Rolls-Royce single engine aircraft, but we have a pretty awesome glide ratio if anything ever were to happen. When I'm practicing my engine out approaches, the way I know I have way too much energy, which I never don't have enough, is I see my spoilers come out, trying to dissipate it just so I can slow down and lose altitude enough to land. 131 feet wide, she glides. Now let's talk about what else we have. 3,000 pounds of payload in environmentally controlled and non-environmentally controlled spaces, depending on what the sensor is and how it best performs. This is why we're in the air. This is a pilot proof, and by that I mean pictures, of how we control our aircraft. It takes off on the other side of the world. I connect via satellite back to Beale Air Force Base, and I talk to the combatant commander through the classified internet. It's that simple. But I bet we have some technical people in the room that want to know a little bit more detail, right? So let's look at it. For takeoff downrange by the aircraft, we have a launch and recovery element, an LRE, with a pilot sitting in there. They connect to the aircraft via narrowband, ultra-high frequency connection. They start, taxi, get clearance to take off, and talk to departure control the same as every other aircraft in the world. But realize I have a mission control element back at Beale Air Force Base or at Grand Forks, our other location. And I'm connected for that entire start sequence. And at any time, I can take control of that aircraft. I'm the co-pilot. I just happen to be 6,000 miles away. Now, once the aircraft gets airborne, we switch over to SATCOM. KU SATCOM is our primary communication once we're airborne. It gets wideband because we take images. We send things back home to be processed. And the LRE pilot downrange does a transfer of aircraft control. The same as any proximately manned aircraft, that's number 2. And back at Beale Air Force Base, I say, I have the aircraft. He or she says, you have the aircraft. The difference now is they become my co-pilot, and my next word is, LRE, you're cleared off. I'll see you in 24 hours for the landing. And they get out of their cockpit, and I now am a single pilot aircraft for the rest of the duration of this 24-plus hour sortie. That's how it works. Now, I wanted to address the most common question I get with the Global Hawk. It's going to be highly technical, so be ready for this. Look at this picture. You see at the top of it, it kind of bulges out at the nose, right? I was not prepared the first time I was asked this question. It's kind of gray. Why does it look like a whale? It wasn't a kid. So in preparing this presentation, my staff wanted me to tell you that when budgets are lean, we put a lieutenant up there and they got to have room to move around a little bit. They're going to be proud I actually use that. But the reality is, remember we connected to SATCOM? We have a SATCOM antenna that sits up there and has to rotate plus or minus 180 degrees and 90 degrees up so that it can always be focused at the satellite so we have good communications. That's why it's bubbled out, to allow the range of motion of that satellite dish. Now this, you walk into any flying unit in the world, and the first thing you see is the local flying area. When I flew F-15s on the coast of Florida, the local flying area was pretty much the Gulf of Mexico. When I flew F-16s at Las Vegas, it was the ranges north of Las Vegas, Nevada. When people come to visit Beale Air Force Base, I always love to throw this up and go, this is the 9th Reconnaissance Wing local flying area. Realize it's almost the entire world. It's where our aircraft sit right now, and it allows us 8 hours of on-station time for everything in the shaded region. That's a lot to remember. So what do I want you to walk away with tonight? At any given time, there are more than 3 Global Hawks airborne under command of 9th Reconnaissance Wing somewhere in the world. That's one Air Force base. That is pretty awesome coverage. Thank you. I don't know if you figured this out yet, but I'm pretty passionate about what I do, and I love my job a lot. This is why we do it. Integrated command and control at any given time. This is an Air Operations Center. This is an actual one, a picture taken from inside it. We have them in multiple locations around the world. It's where the combatant commander and their staff sits to make the life or death decisions about our troops and the forward movement of our effort. This is what it looks like. And it's a phenomenal place. But we have to feed them the right information at the right time to make it a good decision. Now let's talk about our imagery. Electro-optical. It's our highest resolution daytime picture. It's great for doing things like finding buried objects or assessing the condition of a runway so we know if we can put an aircraft in there or if enemy aircraft can take off there. Our infrared sensor takes pictures at night and can sense the infrared signature of vehicles, of buildings, of people. Our synthetic aperture radar takes images at great ranges. And because it's a radar, it can see through clouds. So in these 3 sensors alone, the Global Hawk can see during the day, at night, and in bad weather. Pretty awesome capability. Nobody hides from the Global Hawk. We also have ground moving target indicator, which allows us to discriminate from stationary background clutter, and the colors of those dots correlate with the speed of a target moving or a target of interest. It's an automatic process that is phenomenal and exists in other airframes, but we also have it on some of our blocks of the Global Hawk. Here's one I like, moving pictures. Now granted, they've been around for a couple of years. This is electro-optical on top, infrared on the bottom, raw data on your left. The picture on the right has been processed through a computer algorithm to clean it up and eliminate distortion from the atmosphere. While it's not a new technology that we have full motion video, what is new on the Global Hawk is the range we do it at and the altitude we do it from. Now, who's ready to take this bird airborne? Okay, let's talk about how we do that. This is our assistant dedicated crew chief who pulls the chocks, and we taxi the aircraft out. We actually tow the aircraft out to the starting location. We can start anywhere, but on our base for a flow of aircraft, we have designated spaces we tow it to. That's where we do our ground ops. That's where we start engine, and it is fully autonomous from there, being controlled by the LRE pilot and the MCE pilot. Our two crew chiefs boot up all the systems, check everything just like they do every other aircraft in the world. The primary crew chief then does a walk around to make sure all the panels are closed, everything's ready for flight, all those beautiful flags are taken off and back on our key rings where they belong. Then he hands the aircraft over to the pilot, who does the last check like any pilot in command of any aircraft in the world. Now we're going to take off. Let's go jump in the cockpit. Okay, before we do that, let's talk about one thing. I like to throw in personal stories. So when I go to fly, I'm a texter. It's how I talk to people the most. It's the easiest thing to do. I always want my wife to know I'm off the phone because I can't carry it in the classified building I'm going to fly in, and I want her to know that I'm going out to fly. So she gets the same text every time I get out of my car, glowing global. It's pretty awesome because I mean that literally, right? So now let's jump in the cockpit. Here's what the cockpit was designed to look like. It's pretty simple, 5 screens, 2 people sit there. The pilot is on the lower side on the right, and the sensor operator that controls all those sensors on board the aircraft sits on the left. How easy is that? Whatever goes according to drawings, right? The CEO just talked about drawings up here today, right? Nothing ever goes according to spec. There's always mods, changes, additions. Now we have more than 10 computer screens. Each individual in there has 2 keyboards, 2 mice. He has multiple phones, multiple radios. And if you could see the screen on at the top right that you barely see the corner of, it's a chat room. 30 plus of them, as a matter of fact. He's talking to everybody from the maintainer who's launching the aircraft through the combatant commander staff at the Air Operations Center we saw earlier. Think about that. I'm trying to fly an aircraft, I'm trying to run sensors, and I got to talk to 30 plus people, all who think they are the highest priority in my world. All right? We actually learn to run 2 mice on 2 different computers at any given time. A left-handed mouse and a right-handed mouse. That's the most skilled aviators. Because what do you not see in this cockpit? Control stick, a yoke, a throttle. Does that surprise you? Or is it exactly what you expected? We're going to talk about that, how that works as we go forward. Realize the pilot, although there is no yoke or throttle, controls this aircraft with the same 3-dimensional expertise of any of you that get in any of your aircraft. He calls for taxi, he calls for takeoff, and he talks to departure. And he has the same attitude indicator you do. And guess who generates that in both of our aircraft? A computer. The difference is when I'm talking to those controllers, one thing you probably won't see on yours is flight level 530. So I love to make that call to center when I say flight level 600 and descending or climbing. And I always get the, say again? No, that was not a misspeak. I really am there. So now let's take this bird airborne and see what we really do out there. Let's see how it really operates in the real world every day, 24/7, 365. Oh, did I forget to mention those 2 people in the cockpit? Now are over 200 people in the cockpit. Because we just added, when the wheels went in the well, the distributed common ground system. A clear organization of 27 regionally aligned centers that PED the images we take. Process, exploit, and disseminate. PED. That's one of your other new words for tonight. These airmen are highly trained, and for every image I take in a Global Hawk, it takes them about an hour to process, exploit, and disseminate it for true combat the way they break it out. So what does that really mean? Here's the way I explain it every time I give a tour at Bill. I'm the photographer in our family. A wife and 4 kids, we love to travel, and I'm the one that breaks out the selfie stick I brought in Italy, and the kids hate it. So as I'm building this brief on my laptop at home, I checked my pictures, over 30,000 pictures. And they serve 2 purposes: to fill up my hard drive and slow down my computer. Right? All the photographers in the room are like, yeah, that's true. They mean nothing until somebody does something with them. The Global Hawk takes images. We do surveillance and reconnaissance. These highly trained airmen do the same thing my wife does. When she looks through those 30,000 pictures, finds the 15 that actually mean something, labels them with where we are, who it was, who we were with, and why we care, and puts them in a photo album. That's when they become valuable intelligence. That's what these airmen do, the 200 of them that are working on this ops floor in 27 locations around the country. This is what it looks like. And while there's 200 airmen in here working on my flight, there's 200 more working on a U-2 flight, 200 more working on a different flight. And at any given time, I love to walk in there because I can know what's going on in the entire classified world with one swoop of this center. Because it all comes through here before it goes to the 7 individual combatant commanders around the world. Now let's actually look at some pictures. So we look at this picture and what do we see? If we start from your left and work to the right, we see some cars. We see a couple of buildings. It's obviously an aviation place, a ramp. There's some aircraft out there, right? Anybody disagree with that? We just turned it into intelligence, right? If we want to get more specific or with the trained eye, what do we also see? There's a couple of F-14s, a couple of intruders out there, even some F-18s sitting on the ramp. Is that what intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance is? We have another saying in the Global Hawk. Remember I took you through day, night, and bad weather? The Global Hawk can see your shadow. The Global Hawk can see your shadow. What do we mean by that? It gets hot out on the tarmac, right? Where are all the pilots and their families when it's hot at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon? Laying under their wing, right? Because it's cooler. Well, what happens on the tarmac underneath the aircraft? We'll look up north. C-130 thermal shadow. There has been a C-130 aircraft parked on this ramp that has taxied out in the recent X amount of time, and we can see the shadow of where it was parked. Right? Just when you think you saw everything on a picture, you didn't. What else? We have a Harrier thermal shadow. Wow. So a Harrier in recent time has started, taxied, and taken off. We can see your shadow. Is that it? Is that everything on this picture? Let's zoom in. So to keep your bearings about you, this is the same picture, that's the same thermal shadow I just showed you. But intelligence is not just about what you see, it's about what you don't see, which I just proved through shadows, right? It's not just aircraft. There was a sedan parked right here, which tells me they were doing maintenance on that aircraft. The trained eye can tell you it's a sedan, not a truck. What else do I know? I know this crew chief's taking a break sitting on his toolbox because I see his shadow. What does that tell me? He just launched an aircraft. Do you see a thermal shadow in front of him where an aircraft was sitting? No. So what does that now tell us? He's getting ready to recover an aircraft. That's how much we get when we develop the intelligence from the images we take. What about the aircraft on the ramp? Well, we'll switch sensors and tell you which ones have engines running, which ones don't have engines running, which ones just turn their engines off, because we can see through their skin. Remember, we can see thermal images. All right, let's change gears a little bit and talk about something different. Remember back with me to 2011. An 8.9 magnitude earthquake hit Japan. Does that ring a bell to some of you? It created a 30-foot tsunami. So that's 2 major disasters at one time. Headlines lit up around the world from the destruction, the death, the horror that happened on their countryside, all the way through the fear of their nuclear reactors melting down. You guys remember this with me? The Japanese government asked the U.S. government for assistance. From the time of the earthquake, through the political chain of a government asking for assistance, through the U.S. government saying yes to our aircraft over Japan, was 21 hours. That is pretty impressive. We flew Global Hawks over Japan for over 26 sorties, taking over 3,000 images, and flying over 500 hours. Doing what, you ask? Well, let's look at some of this. We were looking at their countryside to find out that the lower bridge had collapsed. It had fallen on another road, made it impassable. And it had most likely destroyed a gas line, so it's not safe to go there. Instead, we can divert their rescue forces to the bridge on the northeast side, which appears safe to travel. How much would you like to know that information when you're dealing with that level of natural disaster? We work with search and rescue crews to find places above the water line because of the flooding to allow helicopters to land. This is an image of a teacher leading 33 of her students out of a junior high school. We looked at runways to find out which ones were passable, landable, so that rescue forces and assistance forces could get in and not damage their aircraft and cause more harm. We looked at their cities to see what was passable, what was not, to check structural integrity of their buildings, to find out how bad this really was and look for survivors as we went forward. We looked at their ports to find out what damage had been done to what was passable and impassable. This is what the Global Hawk did. As you look at this, what's going on underneath the white? I don't know. So how do I make a recommendation of whether it's bad, good, or a little bit there in between? Well, let's switch sensors and see. As I look through the smoke, it turns out it's just a debris fire, which in the big scheme of things of what they had going on over there, not that big of a deal. And we can send forces in, we can send rescuers in, we can send aid in. We were also looking at Fukushima just north of this. 4 nuclear reactors approaching meltdown. We were watching the temperature of their reactors. We told them as the first 3 of 4 began their meltdown process. As night fell, we continued to watch with our different sensors to monitor the 4th reactor number 2. And we told them before it melted down, and we monitored after the 4th melted down. At the end of this, we returned our Global Hawk back to its departure location. We put the sensors out on it to make sure it was not reactive and it was safe. We gassed her up, put her back in the air. Everything was fine. We were one of the only assets flying because of the nuclear threat of these reactors melting down. From the time we received a request from the government, through our government, to the Global Hawk, processed the information and returned it to the Secretary of State of our nation, was 40 minutes. That is a worldwide operation. So as we were building this, I learned something I'd never heard before. The Global Hawk left a lasting mark on Japan like these pictures didn't show you. This is Dingo. He's one of the squadron commanders of Global Hawk Squadron right now at Beale Air Force Base, Lieutenant Colonel type. Go back to 2012, he was a staff officer at the Pentagon. And he went on a staff trip to Japan because he worked in the Global Hawk office. And he wanted to see what the reaction was of how the governments had reacted and how we could make it better. As part of that trip, he went into this jewelry store because we always, when we're on the road, we always buy our spouse something, right? His escort introduced him to the manager of this, Miss Umihara, a Japanese citizen. And as they were talking in Japanese, the escort said, Miss Umihara, this is a real live Global Hawk pilot. Now, mind you, in California, when I talk about the Global Hawk, there's a lot of the room that has no idea what I'm talking about. So in Japan, Imagine Dingo's surprise when her eyes lit up and she started rattling off Japanese at full speed. He had no idea what was going on. But then they got to talking about it. And it turns out that when the earthquake hit Tokyo, the high-rises, it was so violent that the buildings actually bumped into each other. All the store owners were terrified, and they were watching the local news. And they were assured that the Global Hawk was overhead, looking for survivors, monitoring the nuclear reactors, and assessing the location for safety. So with tears in her eyes, she thanked him for being a Global Hawk pilot, and she asked for his autograph. This hangs in her store today. We used our contacts to get a picture of it last week for this presentation. It was an honor and a privilege, which is what any good military service member would say, right? Because it is. Everything we get to do every day is an honor and a privilege. But to her, it meant so much. And when Dingo told me, he had never told me this story before until we were sitting around the table trying to determine what I would tell you tonight. And I said, I have to tell this story because it tells how much we can do with this aircraft, how much we don't even know yet as we move forward. Okay, like all good flights, they have to come to an end. So let's bring this thing back home and let's talk about how we operate in the FAA environment with all of you. So let's look at air flight. Most of you fly below 20 in your turboprop, other civilian aircraft. Regional jets that come in from the bigger airports fly in the 20s, low 30s. Our primary traditional aircraft are all the way up in the 30s or 40s, right? Where's the Global Hawk? Above 50. So when we look at this at aviators, the easiest thing to do is say, deconflict. Deconflict your flight paths so we don't have to deal with each other. And it's kind of how we're going for the first few years of this. But remember how many flight hours we have? Over 500,000 and growing. Our second 100,000 hours happened in not 15, but 3. Remotely piloted aircraft are becoming a thing of today, not just of the future. Let's go to something else all of you have near and dear to your heart, a beautiful chart, which is much easier to read at 1G than it is up at speed, right? Like many other places we fly, what do we see? We see different airspace, we see civilian fields, we see all the standard stuff on a sectional chart. Nothing special, right? Let's zoom in a little bit. Beale Air Force Base has 3 cautions that I want to talk to you about. First, intensive flight training in vicinity below 16.5. That's pretty common, right? Anywhere we train pilots, and there's a lot of student pilots, which we all were at one point, but now we don't all want to be around all the time. We always see this caution on there. What else do we see? Pave pause radar, stay clear of 1 mile. That's a pretty strong radar if it tells you to stay clear of it 1 mile. That's hazardous. By the way, we live really close to this. What else do we see? Caution unmanned aircraft, all activity. All altitudes. Seriously? I'm the same in my Global Hawk as a radar that can fry an egg at 1 mile? I don't think so. We have to be better about how we move forward. We have to be better about how we integrate, about how we control our aircraft. Because what have I said multiple times now? I talk to the same ground control, the same departure control, and the same center you do. We are no different than you. We are just geo-separated, not sitting in the cockpit of the physical airborne aircraft. All right, it's time to bring it back in and land. It's been a good flight. I've had a good time with you. I hope you guys have enjoyed the journey, but it's time to put it back on the runway and turn it over to the next pilot after it's gassed up for the next sortie. It really is a thing of beauty landing. It really is. Speaking of a thing of beauty, this is runway 15 at Beale Air Force Base. To all the aviators in the world, next to our spouses, this is the most beautiful sight we will see. See how I worked that in? We all have a soft spot in our heart for runways. The way they look, the emotion they evoke when we see them. Let's get away from Beale for a minute and look at a different runway. This is an international runway. To give you a perspective, it's 300 feet wide. Why do I tell you this? Because where are the black marks? If the runway's 300 feet wide, they're plus or minus 75 feet at runway centerline, right? I'm sure none of you left those because we are much better pilots than that. But when you're hand flying an approach, you're working in runway elevation, runway slope, winds, what you had for breakfast that morning, along with 500 other things that may cause you every now and then to be a little bit off center line. For this runway, plus or minus 75 feet. Why do I tell you that? Because in my Global Hawk, I take my left-handed mouse, remember I'm running two of them, and I run it over this button that is cleverly labeled land. And she does all the work for me. She is so much smarter than I am. She figures out the winds, she figures out everything, and she comes into land plus or minus 3 feet of runway center line. These are the black marks on runway 15 just down the runway. Plus or minus 3 feet of runway center line. The biggest complaint we hear from runway managers is their rubber removal plan is not built for Global Hawks. Because we can touch down in the exact same spot every single day, day after day. And they go, you got to move. I don't have money, Frag, to take that rubber off until next year. So we send our mission planners back in the planning cell. They add another decimal to the GPS we're flying off of, and we go, don't worry, we'll move it 2 feet to the right. And we keep our managers happy. Why do I highlight that? Because that is the level of precision we operate these Global Hawks with. I'm an incredible pilot. Just ask me. Any of us. Right? But we are not as precise as a computer doing all the work for us. No matter how good we think we are. That's why I highlight this. So remember when I got in the cockpit, I told you I text my wife, going global. Now you know what I mean by that. Whenever I return and pick up the phone, I text this, back in the USA. That gives you a little bit of insight into how Global Hawk pilots feel when they're operating our aircraft somewhere else around the world. Somewhere that's not California. Somewhere that lives are depending on us and that efforts globally, both humanitarian, combat, conflict, everything rely on the operations of a team of 200 people in the DCGS, a sensor operator, and a pilot sitting in a cockpit at Beale Air Force Base. One of the other things we are dealing with as we move forward is a new concept of deployed in place. I will tell you, a couple of years ago, I had the honor to live in Kabul, Afghanistan with about 700 of my Afghan partners. I had very little sympathy for a unit back at Beale Air Force Base who said they couldn't give me the manpower I needed because they were deployed in place. Because my answer was, you go home to mama and the kids every night. I don't. I have a new perspective of that. The benefit of deployed in place, you do reside at your house. The drawback is you may be on 12-hour shifts at night and have completely the opposite schedule of your family. You're working every weekend when they're off. You're off during the week when they're working. Or more importantly, when I was in Afghanistan and something happened, I went to the chow hall with my best friend and we talked about it. Now, when I text back in the USA, I probably forgot to pick up milk and the commissary's closed. I'm late to a soccer game. And when I get home to dinner and she says, what'd you do today? I go, I flew. Where'd you fly? Can't tell you. What'd you do? Can't talk about it. It's a different challenge for our airmen. Not that we can't do it, it's just a different mentality as we move forward of deployed in place. I want to leave you with one quote. One quote that would be very valid if I authored this, and I wish I was good enough and smart enough and poetic enough to make this happen. We just won a war with a lot of heroes flying around in aircraft. The next war may be fought by airplanes with no men in them at all. Take everything you learned about aviation in war, throw it out the window, and let's go to work on tomorrow's aviation. After what I've told you tonight, I hope all of you now feel that this is valid to some degree. But what is unique about it is it's not one of our senior leaders of the Air Force today that came up with this. It was General Hap Arnold in 1945 who penned this quote. That is the foresight he had back then that we are now living, and we have the opportunity to influence and develop as we move forward. I hope you've learned something about the Global Hawk tonight. I hope you'll know a little bit more about what we are, what we can do, and what the future may hold. I want to thank you for your interest in aviation, for your passion for the future of flight, and for the support of the U.S. Air Force. Thank you very much.